Welcome to the Veil of Truth, your gateway to uncovering hidden insights and illuminating mysteries. I'm thrilled you've joined our global community. Whether you're watching from a bustling city skyline or a quiet countryside, we're glad you're here. Globe showing Europe, Africa, so tell me, where are you tuning in from today? Chapter 1, A Wedding Too Perfect. Hercule Poirot arrived at Ashcombe Grange precisely 7 minutes before noon. He noted this fact with quiet satisfaction, for punctuality, like truth, deserved respect. The great country house stood calm beneath a pale summer sky, its honey-colored stone warmed by early sunlight. White bunting fluttered gently along the terrace, and the scent of roses drifted across the lawn with almost deliberate charm. A wedding, Poirot murmured to himself, adjusting his cuffs. They are always arranged to look perfect. Which is why they so rarely are. Guests were already gathering, dressed in soft colors and polite smiles. Laughter rose and fell like rehearsed music. Footmen moved with careful efficiency. Everything was in order, too much so for Poirot's liking. Disorder, he believed, was honest. Perfection required effort, and effort suggested anxiety. Poirot had been invited by Mrs. Fairlie, the groom's aunt, whom he had once assisted in a minor matter involving a forged letter and an overconfident solicitor. She had written warmly, mentioning the wedding of her nephew and insisting that Poirot must attend. A happy occasion, she had called it. Poirot, reading between the lines, had suspected something else entirely. Happiness, when loudly announced, often concealed unease. The guests turned as the bride arrived. Clara Harrington, now Clara Fairlie, stepped from the carriage with measured grace. Her gown was elegant rather than extravagant, her veil simple, her expression serene. Many admired her calm. Poirot studied it. Calm, he knew, could be cultivated. She greeted relatives and friends with gentle smiles, her voice soft, her manner impeccable. Yet Poirot observed that she kept her hands clasped tightly together, fingers pressing into one another as though anchoring herself. A small detail. A revealing one. Then came the groom. Julien Fairlie was a handsome young man of 29, tall and well-groomed, with the easy confidence of one accustomed to admiration. He laughed readily, shook hands with enthusiasm, and accepted congratulations with charming modesty. But Poirot watched his eyes. They did not rest on Clara for long. They moved instead across the crowd, toward the gates, the driveway, the distant line of trees. He was alert. Watchful. As though this day, meant to bind him, instead made him restless. The ceremony took place in the small chapel beyond the rose garden. Sunlight filtered through the stained glass windows, casting colored patterns across the stone floor. The vicar spoke of love, trust, and unity. The guests listened with indulgent smiles. Poirot listened for something else. When the vows were spoken, Clara's voice did not tremble. Julien's did, only slightly, but enough. Interesting, Poirot thought. The bride steady, the groom uncertain. They exchanged rings. Applause followed. A kiss, politely brief. Cameras flashed. The moment was complete. And yet Poirot felt a faint tightening in his chest, not emotion, but intuition. At the reception, champagne flowed freely. Toasts were made. Julien raised his glass, speaking of gratitude and new beginnings. His words were correct. Carefully chosen. Almost rehearsed. Poirot, holding his own untouched glass, observed the guests. Mrs. Fairlie watched the couple with an expression that hovered between pride and calculation. Her inheritance, Poirot recalled, depended largely on Julien. A fact worth remembering. Nearby stood Edmund Clark, a quiet man with thoughtful eyes, who spoke little and observed much. His gaze lingered on Clara with concern rather than admiration. Then there was Dr. Simon Hargreaves, the family physician, who smiled politely but avoided Julian's eye. Poirot noticed that when Julian laughed too loudly, the doctor frowned almost imperceptibly. Each face told a story. None told the whole truth. As the afternoon wore on, Julian appeared increasingly fatigued. He loosened his tie. He declined a second glass of champagne. Once, Poirot noticed him press a hand briefly against his chest, as though testing a sensation he did not fully understand. "You are unwell, monsieur?" Poirot asked gently when they found themselves momentarily alone. Julian smiled too quickly. "Merely the excitement of the day, Monsieur Poirot. One must expect a little strain." Poirot inclined his head. "Naturally. Though excitement does not usually leave such shadows beneath the eyes." Julian laughed, but the sound lacked ease. "You see everything, I hear." "Only what wishes to be seen," Poirot replied. As evening approached, the newlyweds withdrew early, citing tiredness. Clara rested her hand lightly on Julian's arm as they departed. Her touch appeared supportive, affectionate. Yet Poirot noticed something curious. Julian did not return the gesture. The guests dispersed gradually, the music softened, and Ashcombe Grange settled into a comfortable hush. Lamps were lit. Doors were closed. The house prepared itself for rest. Poirot retired to his room, but sleep did not come easily. His mind replayed the day's details, the restless eyes, the tightened hands, the faint scent of bitter almonds that had briefly drifted through the corridor near the bridal suite before vanishing. Perhaps nothing, he told himself. Perhaps everything. At dawn, the scream shattered the silence. Footsteps echoed. Doors opened. Voices rose in alarm. Poirot stood slowly, straightened his jacket, and reached for his cane. "A wedding," he said quietly, "is a beginning. But sometimes, alas, it is also an ending." He stepped into the corridor, already knowing that Ashcombe Grange would never again be remembered for its perfect day. Chapter 2: Death at Dawn. The scream echoed through Ashcombe Grange like a blade drawn suddenly through silk. It came from the eastern wing, the bridal suite. A high, sharp cry, cut short almost as soon as it began, followed by a dreadful silence. Doors opened along the corridor. Footsteps hurried. Voices murmured in confusion and fear. Hercule Poirot emerged from his room fully dressed, his expression composed but alert. He had been awake already. Experience had taught him that intuition, once stirred, rarely slept. By the time he reached the suite, several people had gathered outside the open door. A maid stood frozen, one hand pressed to her mouth, her face drained of colour. Mrs. Fairley clutched the arm of Dr. Hargreaves, who was already pushing gently but firmly through the small crowd. Poirot paused at the threshold. The room was bathed in pale morning light. Curtains hung half open. The bed, grand and perfectly made the night before, was now disordered only slightly, as if disturbed by necessity rather than struggle. On the bed lay Julian Fairley. He was dressed in his nightshirt, his head turned slightly to one side, his face peaceful, too peaceful. Death had come quietly. There were no marks, no bruises, no signs of violence. One hand rested loosely upon the coverlet. The other lay at his side. Seated beside the bed was Clara Fairley. She did not scream again. She did not move. Her hands were folded in her lap, her gaze fixed upon her husband's face with an expression that might have been grief, or shock, or something else entirely. Her white nightdress contrasted starkly with the dark wood of the furniture, making her seem almost unreal, like a figure in a painting. Dr. Hargreaves stepped forward at once. He checked Julian's pulse, listened briefly to his chest, and then straightened. "I am sorry," he said quietly. "He is dead." Mrs. Fairley gasped. A murmur rippled through the room. Someone began to cry. Poirot remained silent. He moved closer, his eyes traveling carefully from object to object. 2 glasses stood on the bedside table. One was empty. The other remained untouched. A decanter of wine sat nearby, its stopper replaced neatly. On the floor, there was no sign of disturbance. No spilled liquid. No broken glass. Poirot leaned slightly toward the bed. There it was again, that faint, unmistakable scent. Bitter almonds. So light it might easily be imagined. Yet Poirot trusted his senses. "Madam," he said gently, addressing Clara, "would you care to sit somewhere more comfortable?" She looked at him then, as though seeing him for the first time. "I am quite well," she replied softly. Her voice was steady. Remarkably so. Dr. Hargreaves glanced at her with concern. "Shock can present itself in many ways," he said. "Yes," Poirot agreed. "Indeed it can." He turned to the doctor. "May I ask your opinion, doctor?" "The cause of death?" Dr. Hargreaves hesitated only briefly. "At first glance, I would say sudden cardiac failure. It does occur, even in young men, though it is uncommon." "Uncommon," Poirot repeated thoughtfully. Mrs. Fairlie found her voice. "Julian had no heart trouble," she said sharply. "None at all." Dr. Hargreaves nodded. "That is true. But stress, excitement." "A wedding," Poirot murmured. "Yes. A most restful occasion." No one laughed. The local constable was summoned at once, followed shortly by the county inspector. Until their arrival, the household was instructed to remain where they were. Poirot took advantage of the pause. He examined the bedside table more closely. The empty glass bore faint marks where it had been wiped, too carefully. A habit, perhaps. Or an intention. He noticed something else. Julian's wedding ring was not on his finger. Poirot glanced around the room. After a moment, he spotted it resting neatly beside the glass, placed with care. Rings were removed for sleep, certainly, but not usually on the first night of marriage. And rarely placed so deliberately. "Madam," Poirot said quietly, "may I ask, did your husband complain of feeling unwell during the night?" Clara lowered her eyes. "He said he was tired," she replied. "He drank a little wine." "I did not." "You did not drink?" "No." Poirot nodded. "And he removed his ring?" She hesitated. It was slight, barely perceptible, but Poirot saw it. "He said it felt tight," she answered. Poirot inclined his head politely. He did not comment. When the inspector arrived, the room was cleared of unnecessary observers. Statements were taken. Clara repeated her account calmly. Mrs. Fairlie spoke of shock and disbelief. Dr. Hargreaves reiterated his opinion of natural causes, though his certainty seemed less firm than before. Poirot listened. He noticed that no one mentioned the smell. Perhaps they had not perceived it. Or perhaps they preferred not to. As the body was prepared for removal, Poirot caught one final detail. Julian's face bore not fear, nor pain, but resignation. A man surprised by death often showed confusion. Terror. Struggle. Julian Fairlie looked as though he had expected the end. That, Poirot reflected, was the most troubling detail of all. When the room finally emptied, Poirot remained behind for a moment. He stood alone in the bridal suite, surrounded by symbols of celebration now rendered meaningless. "A death without violence," he said softly, "is still a murder, if the mind has guided it." Outside, the house buzzed with restrained panic. Whispers traveled quickly. A wedding had turned into a tragedy before the first morning had properly begun. Poirot straightened his jacket and stepped into the corridor. The game, he knew, had begun. And somewhere within Ashcombe Grange, the truth waited, patient, silent, and dangerously well concealed. Chapter 3: The Grieving Widow. The morning light lingered reluctantly over Ashcombe Grange, as though uncertain whether it should bear witness to the sorrow that now filled the house. Breakfast was neither announced nor served. Guests gathered in small, uneasy clusters, speaking in lowered voices, every sentence trailing into silence. Hercule Poirot moved among them with gentle politeness, offering sympathy while observing carefully. Grief, he knew, was revealing, not in its presence, but in its shape. At 10:30, Clara fairly requested to speak with him. She received Poirot in the small morning room overlooking the garden. The windows were open, and birdsong drifted in, incongruously cheerful. Clara sat very straight in a high-backed chair, her hands folded in her lap, dressed in black though the day before she had been a bride in white. "I am grateful you are here, Monsieur Poirot," she said quietly. "Everything feels unreal." "Yes," Poirot replied gently. "Reality has a habit of becoming most inconvenient." She gave a faint, polite smile, but it did not reach her eyes. Poirot studied her face. It was composed, almost serene. Her eyes were dry. Not from lack of feeling, he suspected, but from a decision, conscious or otherwise, to maintain control. "Madam," he said, "forgive me if my questions seem intrusive. But clarity is often the kindest thing one can offer." "I understand," Clara said. "Please ask what you must." Poirot nodded. "You say your husband drank wine before sleeping. Was this usual?" "Occasionally," she replied. "He preferred it to spirits." "And did he complain of pain? Dizziness? Shortness of breath?" "No. Only tiredness." "Did he take any medicine?" "No." Poirot leaned back slightly. "You did not drink with him?" "I did not feel like it." "Why?" Clara hesitated, then shrugged gently. "It was a long day." Poirot accepted this without comment. There was a pause. "Madam," he said softly, "during the ceremony yesterday, you appeared very calm." Her fingers tightened briefly, then relaxed. "I was happy." "Were you?" She met his gaze directly. "Yes." Poirot inclined his head. "Happiness wears many disguises." She looked away, out toward the garden, where the roses bloomed in careless abundance. "Julian was a complicated man," she said after a moment. "People often mistake charm for simplicity." "Indeed," Poirot agreed. "And what did you mistake him for?" She turned back, startled. "I beg your pardon." Poirot smiled apologetically. "Forgive me." A poor choice of words. But he had seen it, the flicker of something behind her eyes. Not anger. Not fear. Calculation. Later that morning, Poirot spoke with Mrs. Fairlie. The older woman sat rigidly in the drawing room, her posture dignified, her grief sharp-edged and restless. "My nephew was murdered," she declared without hesitation. "I will not accept any other explanation." "On what do you base this belief?" Poirot asked. "Because he was healthy." "And because people lie," she said crisply. "Especially when money is involved." Poirot raised an eyebrow. "You refer to the will?" She nodded. "Julian altered it just before the wedding. Everything now goes to Clara." "And you find this suspicious?" "I find it foolish," Mrs. Fairlie replied. Julian was not a fool. Poirot thanked her and moved on. In the library, he found Edmund Clark standing by the window, staring out into the distance. You cared for Madame Fairlie, Poirot observed. Edmund did not deny it. She was my friend. And your feelings went beyond friendship. Edmund sighed. Once. Long ago. She chose Julian. And now? Now I worry for her. Poirot regarded him thoughtfully. Concern could be genuine. Or convenient. Finally, Poirot requested to speak again with Dr. Hargreaves. They met in the study, where the doctor seemed ill at ease. You have known Julian Fairlie for many years, Poirot said. Yes. And his health? Excellent. Poirot leaned forward. Doctor, if I told you that a substance had been administered slowly, over time, weakening the heart, would you consider this plausible? Dr. Hargreaves stiffened. Such a thing would require careful knowledge. And patience. Yes. And would the final effect resemble natural causes? It could, the doctor admitted reluctantly. Poirot nodded. Thank you. As the day wore on, Poirot returned once more to the bridal suite, now silent and stripped of its tragic centre. He examined the small details again. The wine decanter had been polished. The glasses cleaned. Yet a faint trace remained, barely detectable unless one looked for it. Poirot did look for it. He also noticed something else. On the inside of the wardrobe door was a faint scratch. As though something had been removed hastily. Or hidden, then retrieved. That evening, Poirot sat alone in his room, his thoughts arranged with deliberate care. Clara Fairlie. She had answered every question correctly. Too correctly. She spoke of her husband always as he, never Julian. Distance in language, Poirot knew, was distance of emotion. And yet, she had not been careless. No visible poison. No obvious mistake. But perfection, Poirot reflected, was itself a clue. A woman who had lost her husband mere hours after marriage might collapse. Or rage. Or beg. Clara Fairlie had done none of these things. She had controlled the narrative. And control was never accidental. Poirot folded his hands and closed his eyes. The house was quiet again. But the silence was no longer innocent. Somewhere within Ashcombe Grange, grief was being carefully performed. And somewhere beneath that performance, the truth waited, patient, logical, and fatal. Chapter 4: The House of Hidden Tensions. By the fourth day after the wedding, Ashcombe Grange had taken on the strained stillness of a place holding its breath. The police had not yet announced any conclusions, but their presence lingered in the corridors like a faint draught, unseen, yet constantly felt. Doors were closed more often. Conversation stopped abruptly when footsteps approached. Everyone, Poirot observed, had begun to measure their words. It was in such an atmosphere that truth most often revealed itself. Poirot began the morning with a deliberate walk through the house. He wished not merely to see Ashcombe Grange, but to understand it. Houses, like people, absorbed emotion. They remembered tensions long after voices had fallen silent. The eastern wing, where the bridal suite was located, remained avoided by most of the household. Servants passed it quickly. Guests pretended not to glance toward it. Poirot, however, paused deliberately outside its door. No new marks. No signs of disturbance. Only absence. He turned instead toward the servants' quarters. It was there, he knew, that observations were made freely and without polish. In the housekeeper's room, Mrs. Aldridge sat stiffly, her expression cautious but alert. Poirot greeted her warmly. "Madam," he said, "you have served this house for many years." "Nearly 20, she replied. "Then you will forgive me if I say, you notice things others do not." She hesitated, then nodded. Did you notice anything unusual on the night of the wedding? Poirot asked. Mrs. Aldridge pursed her lips. Mr. Fairley sent his valet away earlier than expected. Said he wished for privacy. And did that strike you as strange? No, sir. It was his wedding night. Poirot smiled faintly. Of course. She continued, lowering her voice. But I did hear him arguing earlier in the evening. Arguing with whom? I could not see clearly, but it sounded like the doctor. Voices raised. Then silence. Poirot thanked her. In the afternoon, Poirot joined the others in the drawing room, where tea was served stiffly and largely untouched. Mrs. Fairley sat opposite Clara, her gaze sharp and unwavering. Clara met it calmly, sipping her tea with measured movements. You are very composed, Mrs. Fairley said abruptly. I wonder how you manage it. Clara set her cup down gently. Grief does not always announce itself loudly. No, Mrs. Fairley replied. Sometimes it hides. Poirot interjected smoothly. Madam, grief wears many masks. We must not assume we recognize them all. Mrs. Fairlier's lips thinned, but she said no more. Poirot noted, however, that Clara's hand trembled slightly when she lifted her cup again. Later, Poirot walked the grounds with Edmund Clark. The younger man seemed relieved by the fresh air. She is stronger than people realize, Edmund said quietly. Clara, I mean. Strength, Poirot replied, is often mistaken for innocence. Edmund frowned. Do you suspect her? I suspect everyone, Poirot said mildly. That is my profession. They stopped near the rose garden. Edmund glanced toward the chapel in the distance. Julian was not happy, he said suddenly. Poirot turned. You are certain of this? Yes. He confided in me once. Said he felt trapped. By the marriage? Edmund hesitated. By expectation. Expectation, Poirot knew, was a powerful thing. That evening, Poirot requested access to Julian Fairlier's study. The room was orderly to the point of sterility. Books arranged precisely. Papers aligned. A desk cleared of anything personal. Too clear. Poirot examined the drawers. One contained old correspondence. Another, business documents. The third was empty. Or rather, it had been emptied recently. The faint outline of a paperweight marked the polished wood. Dust disturbed. Something had been removed. Poirot closed the drawer slowly. From the study window, he could see the path leading toward the village. Julian's eyes had often wandered in that direction, Poirot recalled. A man longing for escape. That night, Poirot dined alone. The atmosphere was too strained for shared meals. As he finished, a maid approached hesitantly. Sir, she whispered, Mrs. Fairley wishes to see you. Clara received him in the same morning room as before. I feel, she said, without preamble, that I am being watched. Poirot regarded her thoughtfully. Are you? Yes. And does that trouble you? It does, she replied, then paused. Though perhaps it should not. Poirot leaned forward. Madam, the truth is rarely troubled by attention. Her eyes flashed briefly, anger, perhaps. Or fear. You think I am capable of murder, she said quietly. I think you are capable of planning, Poirot replied. Which is not the same thing. There was a long silence. Finally, Clara stood. I loved my husband. Poirot rose as well. Madam, love is not the opposite of murder. Often, it is the motive. As he left the room, Poirot felt the tension tighten further. The house was drawing its lines. Everyone had something to lose. And someone, Poirot knew with increasing certainty, had already decided that loss was preferable to truth. Chapter 5. Small details, large meaning. Hercule Poirot had always maintained that the grand gestures distracted, while the small details confessed. On the 5th day after Julian Fairlier's death, Ashcombe Grange seemed determined to confess nothing at all. It presented itself as calm, dignified, and exhausted by grief. Yet to Poirot, the house hummed with concealed purpose. He began the morning in the breakfast room, where Clara Fairlie sat alone at the long table. A single place had been laid before her. The opposite chair, Julian's chair, remained conspicuously empty. "You keep the place set," Poirot observed gently as he joined her. Clara looked up, startled, then nodded. It seemed wrong to change it. "Change," Poirot said softly, "is often resisted when it threatens memory." She did not reply. Poirot's gaze drifted to her cup. She drank tea now, not coffee. A minor alteration. Yet people under strain often clung to habit, or altered it deliberately. "Madam," Poirot said, "may I ask, did your husband have habits you found inconvenient?" Clara's fingers tightened around the cup. Julian was particular. "A man of order?" "Yes." Poirot smiled faintly. Then he would notice disorder immediately. She glanced at him, puzzled. "Forgive me," Poirot continued, "but I find it curious that the bedside table was arranged so neatly after the wine was taken. A tired man, about to sleep, rarely replaces the stopper so carefully. You think someone tidied it afterward?" "I think," Poirot replied, "that someone wished the room to speak of calm." Later that morning, Poirot requested permission to examine the wine cellar. Mrs. Fairlie agreed readily, though with visible impatience. "Wine is wine," she said. "It will not explain my nephew's death." Poirot disagreed silently. The cellar was cool and dim, rows of bottles resting in disciplined lines. Poirot examined the decanter used on the wedding night. It had been washed thoroughly. Too thoroughly. "Tell me," Poirot asked the butler, "who prepared the wine that evening?" "I did, sir," the man replied. "As instructed." "And the glasses?" "The same." Poirot nodded. "Did anyone else have access afterward?" The butler hesitated. "The bridal suite was private, sir." "Private." An interesting word. Returning upstairs, Poirot paused outside the doctor's room. Dr. Hargreaves answered at once, his expression wary. "Doctor," Poirot said pleasantly, "you spoke earlier of substances that weaken the heart over time." "Yes." "Would such a substance leave a taste?" "Possibly." "Bitter, perhaps?" Poirot inclined his head. "And would a man accustomed to wine notice this?" "Likely," the doctor admitted. Poirot smiled. Unless he had been noticing it for some time already. The doctor stiffened. "What do you mean?" "Only this," Poirot said calmly. "That Julian Fairlie may not have been surprised by his condition." Dr. Hargreaves said nothing. In the afternoon, Poirot returned to Julian's study with renewed focus. He examined the empty drawer again, this time more closely. The wood bore a faint indentation, rectangular, consistent with a small leather case. A letter case, perhaps. Poirot searched the room carefully. Nothing. But in the waste-paper basket, recently emptied, but not perfectly, he found a fragment of torn envelope. The paper was thick. Expensive. Addressed in a woman's hand. Poirot folded it carefully and placed it in his pocket. Later, he encountered Edmund Clark near the staircase. "You told me Julian felt trapped," Poirot said. "Yes." "Did he ever speak of leaving?" Edmund hesitated. "Once." He said he had made a mistake. And did he say what that mistake was? Edmund looked away. He said, marrying for advantage rather than affection was dangerous. Poirot nodded. Indeed. That evening, Poirot observed Clara again. She moved through the house quietly, speaking little, acknowledging condolences with practiced grace. Yet when she passed the study, her step faltered, just slightly. Poirot followed. Inside, she stood by the desk, staring down at the polished surface. "You are looking for something," Poirot said gently from the doorway. She turned sharply. "No." "Madam," Poirot said, "you are not a woman who wanders without purpose." Her composure cracked, only for a second. "I thought, perhaps something of Julian's remained." Poirot stepped closer. "Did he keep letters here?" "Yes," she said quickly. Too quickly. "Business letters." "And personal ones?" She hesitated. Poirot nodded. "Then perhaps they have already been removed." Her eyes met his. For the first time, something like fear flickered there. "You think I have hidden something," she said. "I think," Poirot replied, "that someone wished to control what Julian left behind." She laughed softly, without humor. "Dead men leave many things." "Yes," Poirot agreed. "Especially intentions." That night, Poirot reviewed his thoughts carefully. Julian had been poisoned slowly, this seemed increasingly clear. The final dose administered with wine. But Julian had suspected. He had argued with the doctor. He had removed his ring. He had altered his will. Why? Because he planned to leave. The missing letters would explain everything. And the person with most to gain from their absence was also the person with the greatest access. Clara Fairley. Yet Poirot knew better than to conclude too quickly. There were still other hands in the shadows. Other motives simmering quietly. But the picture was sharpening. Small details were aligning themselves into meaning. And meaning, Poirot knew, was the most dangerous thing of all, because once it appeared, the truth could not remain hidden for long. Chapter 6: False Paths. By the 6th day, suspicion at Ashcombe Grange had settled like a fog, thick, shifting, and misleading. Everyone felt it. Servants whispered. Guests avoided one another's eyes. Even the police, now visiting more frequently, seemed uncertain where to direct their attention. This, Poirot knew, was the most dangerous stage of an investigation, when too many possibilities obscured the right one. He allowed the fog to thicken. For it was often in false paths that the guilty revealed themselves. That morning, Poirot walked deliberately with Inspector Bell, the county officer now formally in charge. Bell was a competent man, earnest and methodical, but inclined toward obvious solutions. "We have 3 reasonable suspects," Bell said as they crossed the gravel path. "The widow, the aunt, and the doctor." "And the friend," Poirot added mildly. Bell frowned. "Clark?" "He loved her, perhaps, but that does not make him a murderer." "Love," Poirot replied, "is a most efficient accelerant." Bell nodded thoughtfully. "Still, there's no proof." Poirot smiled. "Proof is shy. It prefers to be invited." The first false path led to Mrs. Fairley. Poirot allowed it to unfold naturally. He made a point of asking questions within her hearing. He spoke openly of inheritance, of resentment, of bitterness toward Clara. Mrs. Fairley noticed. That afternoon, she confronted Poirot in the drawing room. "You are trying to trap me," she said coldly. Poirot inclined his head. "I am trying to understand you." "I loved my nephew," she snapped. "And I did not kill him." Poirot studied her carefully. Her anger was genuine. her grief sharp and unfiltered. "You are a woman of strong emotion, madam," Poirot said gently. "Too strong to hide behind subtlety." She stared at him, then turned away. Poirot dismissed her as a killer, but not as a danger. The second false path led to Dr. Hargreaves. Poirot spoke openly of poisons, of medical knowledge, of opportunity. The doctor grew visibly strained. His hand shook when he poured tea. "You think I did this," he said finally. "You think I poisoned him?" "I think," Poirot replied carefully, "that you suspected something." Dr. Hargreaves sank into a chair. "Yes," he admitted. "Julian came to me days before the wedding. He said he felt weak, dizzy, that his heart raced for no reason." "And what did you tell him?" "I warned him," the doctor said quietly. "I told him to postpone the wedding, to rest, to investigate further." "And did he listen?" "No. He said it was too late." Poirot nodded. "Too late for what, doctor?" Dr. Hargreaves did not answer. The third false path was Edmund Clark. Poirot encouraged the police to question him more closely. They did. Thoroughly. Edmund endured it with quiet dignity. "I did not kill Julian," he said simply. "And if I had wished him gone, I would not have waited until the wedding night." True enough. That evening, Poirot sat alone in the library, the false paths now clearly marked and safely discarded. But false paths existed for a reason. Someone had wanted suspicion to spread. Someone had wanted confusion. Poirot returned to the central question: why remove the letters? If Julian intended to leave Clara, those letters would expose him. They would also expose whoever had discovered his plan first. Poirot recalled Clara standing in the study, her hesitation at the door, her fear when he mentioned letters. But there was still a missing piece. Why kill him then? Why not allow him to leave and be disgraced? Unless his leaving would not disgrace him alone. Unless it would reveal something far worse. Poirot summoned Clara the next morning. She entered calmly, but her eyes betrayed exhaustion. "You have eliminated the others," she said quietly. "I can see it in your face." Poirot smiled gently. "Faces are very honest. And now you return to me." "Yes." She sighed. "Then say it." Poirot leaned forward. "Julian was not merely planning to leave you. He was planning to expose you." Her eyes widened. "That is absurd." "Is it?" Poirot asked softly. "You were not always Clara Harrington." Her breath caught. "You had another name," Poirot continued. "Another life. One that Julian discovered too late." She said nothing. "He planned to use the wedding," Poirot said, "to secure his position, then leave, with evidence." Clara's composure shattered. "You do not understand," she whispered. "He would have destroyed me." Poirot nodded. "So you destroyed him first." She closed her eyes. "But not," Poirot added, in a moment of passion. In a series of careful steps. Slow poison. Patience. Planning. Tears slipped down her cheeks, not from fear, but from release. "You still lack proof," she said quietly. Poirot smiled. "For now." As he left her, Poirot felt the fog begin to lift. The false paths had served their purpose. Only one road remained. And it led, inevitably, to the truth. Chapter 7: The Truth Beneath the Vows. By the seventh day, Ashcombe Grange had become a house of shadows. Every corridor seemed to hum with the echo of whispered suspicions, every room carried the weight of unseen glances. Guests and servants alike moved with care, as though afraid that their footsteps might betray them. Even the flowers in the rose garden seemed subdued, heavy with morning dew and the memory of a wedding that had ended before its promise could fully bloom. Hercule Poirot, however, moved freely. Calm. Unhurried. His sharp eyes noted everything, the subtle creases in the curtains, the faint smudge on the windowsill, the misaligned books on a shelf. Each insignificant detail was, in his mind, a potential key to the puzzle. He had already traced the false paths carefully: Mrs. Fairlier's bitterness, Dr. Hargreaves' anxiety, Edmund Clark's quiet concern. All of these could mislead the inexperienced detective. But Poirot was never inexperienced. He knew that the guilty mind often leaves the most subtle traces of itself, hidden among ordinary life. That morning, Poirot requested that all the key figures gather in the drawing room. It was an unusual move, but necessary. Clara Fairlie entered first, her expression composed, though the faint shadows beneath her eyes suggested exhaustion. Mrs. Fairlie followed, radiating dignity and impatience. Edmund Clark lingered near the window, silent, watching. Dr. Hargreaves, pale and tense, settled stiffly into a chair. Even the housekeeper and the butler appeared, summoned for their small but significant observations. Poirot stood in the center of the room, hands clasped, posture impeccable. "Mesdames et messieurs," he began, "we are gathered today not for tea, nor for mourning, but for truth." Every eye turned toward him. Clara's, sharp and alert. Mrs. Fairlier's, defensive. The others, watchful. Poirot continued, his voice smooth but precise. "A man has died under circumstances that appear sudden. Yet suddenness, Miss Amos, is often carefully arranged. Our dear Julian Fairlie did not die by accident. He died because someone wished it." There was a faint intake of breath from Mrs. Fairlie. Clara's lips pressed together. The doctor remained still. "Now," Poirot said, moving slowly to stand beside the empty chair at the table, "let us consider the facts, as any detective must." He held up one hand, long fingers straight. First, the bedside table. 2 glasses. One used, one untouched. A decanter polished too carefully. Someone wished the room to appear as if nothing unusual had occurred. Yet a faint residue remained, a taste bitter, familiar to those trained in observation. Bitter almonds. He lowered his hand. Second, the ring. Removed deliberately. A man in perfect health, newly married, does not remove his ring without reason. Julian suspected what was about to occur. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. Third, the letters. Fragments found in the waste basket. Papers removed from the study. Letters that could expose intentions, or secrets, or even past misdeeds. These were not taken by chance. Someone planned carefully to ensure they vanished. Mrs. Fairlier's hand trembled slightly on the arm of her chair. Clara's composure remained, though her eyes glinted with something like steel. Poirot raised a finger. And finally, the motive. The most dangerous of all, for it is always hidden within the heart. Julian intended to leave. Not merely to abandon his bride, but to expose the woman he considered untrustworthy, the woman who had something to hide. A past life, perhaps, or connections that he had discovered. And that woman, Miss Amos, had means, opportunity, and patience. She waited. She struck. She ensured that the death would appear natural. Clara's eyes widened slightly, but she remained seated, upright, unflinching. Poirot continued. Monsieur Clark loved her. He would not act. Mrs. Fairlier's anger was real, but impulsive. Dr. Hargreaves possessed knowledge, but no motive beyond concern. Only one person combined knowledge, motive, and access. Clara shifted slightly in her chair. Her hands, folded, tightened. Poirot's eyes softened. Madam, you loved him, and not as he was, but as you believed him to be. When you discovered he intended to leave, perhaps to betray you in some fashion, your fear and sense of self-preservation drove your actions. You administered a substance slowly, over time, weakening his heart. And then, on the night of the wedding, you delivered the final dose in wine. The method was subtle. The signs minimal. A death disguised as natural. But he suspected. That is why he removed his ring. That is why he did not rest peacefully. And that is why he argued with the doctor days before his death. Clara's lips parted slightly, then closed again. She said nothing. Poirot gestured toward her gently. You acted with precision, patience, and deliberation. Yet even precision cannot erase emotion entirely. It appears in small details, a hesitation, a tremor, a glance too sharp, a hand that tightens briefly. All of these betrayed you, without your knowing. Mrs. Fairlie gasped softly. Impossible, she whispered. She could not have eaten my nephew. Poirot inclined his head politely. Ah, madam. Appearances are deceiving. And grief is often assumed where cunning exists. He turned to the others. Let us consider the sequence. Weeks of subtle poisoning. Arguments with the physician. Alteration of the will, so that Clara would inherit everything, leaving Mrs. Fairlie without the expected claim. Removal of letters that could expose prior intentions. And, finally, the final dose delivered during a time of celebration, masked as a wedding night pleasure. Everything was orchestrated to appear as natural tragedy, while removing obstacles, witnesses, and threats. Dr. Hargreaves swallowed audibly. Poirot's gaze returned to Clara. Madam, I must ask you, did you ever doubt that your plan might be discovered? She exhaled slowly. I knew he would suspect. But I did not act in haste. Every step was calculated. It was necessary. Poirot's hands clasped in front of him. Justice is not about necessity. It is about truth. And truth, madam, has a remarkable habit of revealing itself, even when carefully concealed. There was a long pause. Clara's face betrayed a mixture of relief, sorrow, and perhaps a strange pride. For a moment, she seemed younger, smaller, just a woman who had been cornered by circumstance. Poirot turned finally to the room. Ladies and gentlemen, the case is closed. The guilty is revealed. The motives, methods, and moments are clear. Only one person could have executed this crime with such precision. And yet, justice is not only about accusation, but about understanding. Madame Fairlie acted out of fear, love, and desperation. But act she did. He paused, allowing the weight of the revelation to settle. Now, he added softly, the law will take its course. And Ashcombe Grange may begin, at last, to breathe again. Clara lowered her head, quietly accepting both judgment and relief. Mrs. Fairlie's face was ashen, disbelief mingled with sorrow. Edmund Clark closed his eyes. Relief and grief intertwined. Dr. Hargreaves sank back in his chair, pale but silent, resigned to the truth. Poirot straightened. A wedding, he said, almost to himself, is a promise. A union of hearts. And yet, it can reveal the deepest intentions, the most hidden fears, and, in this case, the most dangerous of human calculations. It is in the quiet moments, the subtle gestures, the small details, that we find the truth. Always, the truth. As he left the drawing room that evening, Ashcombe Grange seemed quieter. Lighter. And yet, in its stillness, Poirot sensed the lingering weight of what had passed, the hidden tensions, the careful plotting, the life taken under the guise of ceremony. He smiled faintly, adjusting his cuffs. Once again, his methodical mind had unveiled the truth. Once again, order had been restored. And once again, Hercule Poirot walked away, calm, deliberate, and triumphant, leaving a house forever changed by secrets revealed and justice served. Chapter 8 of Poirot Explains Everything. The evening of the 7th day had faded into a pale twilight. Ashcombe Grange, with its tall windows and polished floors, seemed almost mournful, as though the house itself had absorbed the grief, the tension, and the secrets of the past week. Guests had been politely dismissed. The staff moved quietly, careful not to disturb the delicate equilibrium. Only Hercule Poirot remained fully in command of the atmosphere, his calm figure framed by the fading light of the drawing room. He had summoned all the key figures once more, Clara Fairlie, Mrs. Fairlie, Edmund Clark, and Dr. Hargreaves. Even the housekeeper and the butler stood discreetly to the side, as witnesses rather than participants. Poirot's plan was simple: the truth must be laid bare, and the guilty confronted with facts, not supposition. He stood, hands clasped behind his back, in his usual impeccable posture. Mesdames et messieurs, he began, we are assembled not merely to recount events, but to examine them. To consider each action, each hesitation, each small detail, and to understand why a man of health, youth, and promise has met an untimely death. He paused, allowing his words to settle. Let us begin with Julien Fairlie himself, Poirot continued. A man young, handsome, privileged, but not unwise. He knew the danger approaching him. He suspected treachery. That is why he removed his ring on the first night of marriage. Not in rashness, but in preparation. Clara's hand, resting calmly in her lap, tightened just slightly. Poirot's keen eyes caught it. Now, he said, consider the bedside table. 2 glasses. One used, one untouched. A decanter polished with unusual care. Anyone would see only neatness. But the residue, the faint taste of bitter almonds, reveals the truth to those who look closely. It was poison. Slow. Calculated. Administered not in haste, but over time, weakening the heart, preparing it for the final act. He allowed the words to hang. Mrs. Fairlie's eyes widened, and Dr. Hargreaves' hand twitched. Clara remained outwardly composed. The letters, Poirot continued, moving deliberately toward Julien's study desk, were removed. Carefully. Fragments found in the wastebasket confirmed the act. They contained information that would have revealed Julien's intention to abandon the marriage and expose certain, inconvenient truths. These letters were removed to ensure the scheme's success and to prevent exposure of the perpetrator's identity. He turned slowly toward the gathered company. We have examined the false paths, the aunt, whose anger was real but impulsive, the doctor, whose knowledge could aid a plan but whose motives were protective rather than personal, and the friend, Edmund Clark, whose concern was genuine and his love unacted upon. All of these could mislead an observer. And yet, they are innocent of the act itself. Poirot paused, letting his gaze rest on Clara. The room seemed to contract. Even the fading sunlight could not disguise the tension. Which brings us to the person who combined opportunity, motive, and patience in equal measure, Poirot said quietly. Madame Clara Fairlie. The widow did not flinch. She met his gaze directly, a quiet defiance mixed with resignation. Do not misunderstand, Poirot continued. I do not accuse lightly. Nor do I assume malice where fear and desperation might guide action. But the evidence is unmistakable. Julien intended to leave. He planned to expose your past, madam, and perhaps to leave you disgraced or vulnerable. And you, fearing the consequences, acted to protect yourself. Clara's lips parted, then pressed together. For the first time, her composure faltered. Your method was precise, Poirot said. Weeks of slow poisoning, culminating in a final dose on your wedding night, delivered with wine. Carefully controlled. Timed. Hidden. The hand that poisoned was steady, the mind methodical, the actions deliberate. Julian suspected, hence the removed ring, hence the arguments with Dr. Hargreaves, hence the tension in his final days. And yet, your plan succeeded in appearance. Death was disguised as natural, leaving few signs, no obvious evidence, no struggle. He lifted a finger. But perfection is impossible. Even in careful crime, small details betray the perpetrator. The hesitation in your voice when questioned. The trembling of your fingers when handling objects associated with him. The slight hesitation in movement near the study. These, Miss Amis, are the footprints of guilt. Poirot turned to the rest of the room. The others may seem implicated, Mrs. Fairlie, Dr. Hargreaves, Edmund Clark, but they are innocent. They were simply caught in the web of misdirection. Only one person had both the motive and the precise opportunity to act. Only one person had the calm, patience, and meticulous mind to plan so carefully. He returned his gaze to Clara. Madam, your actions were not random, nor born of sudden passion. They were planned, deliberate, and executed with care. Yet even such planning cannot erase emotion entirely, and emotion, I observed, left its trace. Clara exhaled softly, her hands folding together in her lap. Yes, she said quietly, voice steady but tinged with sorrow. I did what I believed necessary. He would have destroyed me. My life, my reputation, everything. I had no choice. Poirot inclined his head gently. Choices, madam, are always present. It is our nature to choose, even under duress. Your actions were those of fear, of desperation, of preservation. But they remain, nevertheless, actions that the law must now consider. Mrs. Fairlie gasped. Impossible. My nephew. My family. How could you? Madam, Poirot interrupted, his voice polite but firm, we must distinguish between grief and culpability. Your anger and sorrow are genuine. But they do not substitute for fact. And the facts, in this matter, point to the careful orchestration of Madame Clara Fairlie. Edmund Clark remained silent, pale, his hands clenched. She acted to protect herself, he murmured softly. I cannot blame her entirely. Perhaps not, Poirot said, but the outcome remains. Julian Fairlie is dead. The method was precise. The motive was fear and anticipation of betrayal. And the truth, now revealed, spares no illusion. Dr. Hargreaves leaned back in his chair, exhausted, pale, but relieved that suspicion had been clarified. Yes, he said quietly. Everything fits. Poirot folded his hands. We see the sequence clearly now. Julian, aware of danger, removed his ring. He confronted the doctor, discussed symptoms and weakness. Letters that would expose him or reveal Madame's past were removed. The poison, slow in effect, left almost no trace. The final act was delivered carefully on the night of the wedding. And the appearance of calm, grief, and composure concealed the method from casual observation. He allowed the room a moment to absorb his words. The house, quiet and solemn, seemed to lean in, as though listening. Thus, the truth emerges, Poirot concluded. The guilty mind acted deliberately, anticipating every move, concealing intent, yet leaving subtle signs, hints detectable only to the observant. The innocent were misled. The guilty is revealed. Justice will now take its course. Clara lowered her head, her composure returning with the quiet dignity of acceptance. She neither pleaded nor protested. She had acknowledged the inevitable. Poirot straightened, smoothing his cuffs. A wedding is a union, a promise of trust, of affection, of shared future. And yet, it can also reveal the deepest intentions, the hidden fears, the secrets we believe buried. In this case, the very celebration designed to unite hearts became the stage for revelation and consequence. It is in the small details, the careful observation, the subtle gestures, that truth is always revealed. Always. He stepped back slightly, allowing the room to reflect on his words. The tension, once almost unbearable, began to ease. The house seemed to breathe again, though faintly, as though relieved that clarity had finally arrived. Poirot looked around Ashcombe Grange one last time. The roses in the garden caught the last light of the sun. The corridors, once echoing with suspicion and fear, were now calm. The storm of secrets had passed. Order, however fragile, was restored. With his usual grace, Hercule Poirot turned, his mind already cataloguing the lessons of human nature, the perfection of small details, and the certainty that justice, subtle yet relentless, always finds its way. And thus, with elegance, method, and psychological insight, the mystery of Julian Fairlier's death was resolved. The truth, at last, had been unveiled.